In the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the height of its apparent power. 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had swept aside Western naval forces across the Pacific, captured vast territories, and shattered the myth of Anglo-American maritime supremacy in Asia. Its carrier force, the Kaido Butai, remained intact, experienced, and undefeated. From Tokyo, the war appeared to be unfolding according to pre-war expectations. A rapid offensive would cripple enemy resistance, followed by a decisive battle that would force the United States to negotiate. This confidence was not accidental. It was the product of a deeply ingrained institutional assumption that had shaped Japanese naval doctrine for decades. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed that wars between great powers would be decided by a single, climactic engagement between battle fleets. This concept, known as Kantai-Kessen, held that through superior training, morale, and tactical execution, Japan could defeat a materially superior opponent in one decisive encounter. The assumption was not merely cultural. It was operational, logistical, and strategic. Fleet design, pilot training, command structures, and planning methodologies were all built around it. At the center of this belief was a second, equally critical assumption: that secrecy and operational surprise would allow Japan to control the timing and conditions of that decisive battle. Japanese planners understood that the United States possessed greater industrial capacity. They therefore assumed that victory depended on striking before American strength could be fully mobilized, and before American commanders could accurately perceive Japanese intentions. Intelligence superiority, achieved through cryptographic security and deception, was treated as a force multiplier that would compensate for long-term material inferiority. By early 1942, these assumptions appeared validated. The United States Navy had suffered heavy losses at Pearl Harbor, and although American carriers remained operational, their movements were thought to be reactive and cautious. Japanese naval intelligence assessed that U.S. morale was low, coordination poor, and doctrine untested. The successful raids across the Indian Ocean and the fall of Singapore reinforced the perception that Japan retained strategic initiative. Within this framework, the decision to attack Midway Atoll emerged as a logical extension of existing doctrine. Midway was not valuable primarily for its intrinsic worth. It mattered because it was expected to draw out the remaining American carriers. By threatening a forward base close to Hawaii, Japanese planners believed they could force the U.S. Navy into battle under unfavorable conditions. Once the carriers were destroyed, American resistance in the Pacific would become strategically irrelevant for years. This plan rested on the assumption that the United States did not know it was coming. Operational planning for Midway reflected this confidence. The Japanese combined fleet devised a complex, multi-pronged operation involving diversionary forces in the Aleutians, submarine picket lines, and a widely dispersed carrier and battleship formation. The complexity was not seen as a liability. On the contrary, it was believed to enhance surprise by masking the main effort. Japanese planners assumed that American intelligence capabilities were rudimentary and that their own naval codes remained secure. There was no institutional expectation that the enemy might possess advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions at the operational level. This belief shaped not only planning, but also risk tolerance. Japanese commanders accepted narrow margins for error because they assumed informational asymmetry was on their side. The timing of strikes, the sequencing of carrier operations, and the dispersal of forces all depended on the enemy reacting late and incorrectly. If that condition held, the plan would function as designed. It is critical to understand why this assumption made sense at the time. Japanese naval cryptography had not suffered a known catastrophic breach. Previous operations had not been compromised in ways that suggested deep penetration. Intelligence failures were typically attributed to chance, weather, or enemy caution rather than systemic compromise. Furthermore, the Japanese intelligence apparatus was oriented toward tactical reconnaissance, not counterintelligence. There was little institutional emphasis on questioning whether secrecy itself had failed. On the American side, Japanese planners believed that even if fragments of information were intercepted, the United States lacked the analytical capacity and organizational coherence to translate signals intelligence into actionable operational decisions. American naval intelligence was viewed as fragmented, under-resourced, and subordinate to commanders who still privileged traditional reconnaissance. This assessment was outdated, but Japan had no reliable mechanism to detect that fact. As a result, the Midway operation proceeded under conditions of assumed invisibility. Japanese commanders believed they were shaping the battlefield from a position of informational dominance. Every subsequent decision, from force composition to timing, depended on that belief remaining true. By May 1942, the operational die was cast. Carriers were assigned, air groups prepared, and logistical support positioned. The Japanese Navy expected to fight a battle of execution, not discovery. They believed the critical challenge would be coordinating strikes under combat conditions, not coping with an enemy who knew when and where to be. What they did not understand was that this foundational assumption had already collapsed. American cryptanalysts had penetrated key elements of Japanese naval communications. They had identified Midway as the target, estimated the timing of the operation, and inferred the composition of the attacking force. This intelligence was not perfect, but it was sufficient to alter the decision environment entirely. U.S. commanders did not need to search blindly for the enemy. They could position their limited carrier strength in advance, concentrate forces, and accept risks that would otherwise have been irrational. The Japanese plan, built on secrecy, was now exposed to an adversary operating with foreknowledge. By June 1942, the assumption that had underwritten Japanese naval strategy, that surprise and secrecy would offset American recovery, stopped being true. The battle that followed would not be decided by last-minute heroics or sudden luck. It would be decided by the delayed consequences of an intelligence imbalance Japan could neither perceive nor correct in time. The Japanese plan for Midway was not improvised. It was the product of a naval system refined over decades, designed to deliver a decisive blow through controlled escalation and centralized execution. Understanding why that system failed requires first understanding how it was intended to function when operating under its assumed conditions. At the core of Japanese carrier doctrine was the concept of concentrated striking power. Carriers were not treated as independent maneuver units. Instead, they were grouped into a single, tightly controlled force whose purpose was to deliver overwhelming aerial attacks at moments chosen by fleet command. Aircraft were not launched continuously or opportunistically. They were assembled, armed, and dispatched in carefully coordinated waves designed to saturate enemy defenses and achieve decisive results in a single sequence. This approach reflected both experience and constraint. Japanese naval aviation emphasized quality over quantity. Pilots were extensively trained, often taking years to reach operational status. Aircraft handling procedures prioritized precision and safety over speed. As a result, Japanese carriers excelled at delivering well-coordinated first strikes, but they lacked procedural flexibility once that cycle was disrupted. The system worked best when commanders controlled the pace of battle. Command structure reinforced this rigidity. Tactical authority over the carrier force was centralized at the fleet level. Carrier captains and air group leaders executed orders, but decision-making authority regarding strike timing, target priority, and rearming cycles rested with senior commanders. This ensured unity of effort, but reduced the ability of individual units to adapt independently to unexpected developments. Information flow within this system was linear and hierarchical. Reconnaissance reports flowed upward, were assessed centrally, and then translated into orders that flowed back down. This process assumed that information would arrive in time to shape deliberate decisions. It was not designed for environments where incomplete or delayed information required rapid decentralization. The Midway operation placed extraordinary strain on this structure. Japanese forces were divided across vast distances, with carriers, battleships, cruisers, submarines, and invasion forces operating on separate axes. Coordination depended on precise timing and accurate intelligence. Submarine picket lines were intended to detect American movements, while diversionary attacks in the Aleutians were designed to dilute American response. Each component assumed the others would function as planned. Carrier operations themselves were built around a fixed sequencing logic. Aircraft launched for the initial strike against Midway were expected to return, be recovered, refueled, and rearmed before any major engagement with American carriers. The doctrine assumed that the enemy carrier force would be located and destroyed only after the Midway airfield was neutralized. This sequencing mattered because Japanese carriers lacked the deck space and procedures to arm anti-ship and land attack munitions simultaneously at scale. Switching roles mid-cycle was possible, but it imposed delays and increased risk. These delays were acceptable under the assumption of surprise. If the enemy did not know where the carriers were, the Japanese force could afford time to rearm methodically. The doctrine assumed that the first contact with American carriers would occur after Japanese aircraft were prepared for that contingency. This was not a flaw within the system as designed. It was a calculated trade-off. Logistics reinforced these assumptions. Japanese carriers carried limited reserves of aviation fuel and ordnance compared to their American counterparts. The system depended on efficient usage and predictable sequencing. There was little margin for prolonged, high-tempo operations involving repeated deck cycles under threat. Carrier doctrine, therefore, emphasized decisive engagements over sustained attrition. The reconnaissance system supporting this doctrine was similarly optimized for expected conditions. Long-range search aircraft were allocated sparingly, based on assumptions about enemy position and intent. Search patterns were narrow, designed to confirm expectations rather than explore uncertainty. The system prioritized positive identification over exhaustive coverage. What was less appreciated was how brittle this arrangement became when its assumptions were violated. Centralization meant that delays in information cascaded through the entire force. Rigid sequencing meant that interruptions created compounding effects rather than localized problems. Limited deck flexibility meant that aircraft caught in transition represented not just a temporary inconvenience, but a systemic vulnerability. American doctrine, by contrast, was evolving in a different direction. U.S. carrier operations emphasized flexibility, continuous flight operations, and decentralized initiative. These differences would matter, but they were secondary to the more fundamental asymmetry. American commanders entered the battle with foreknowledge that allowed them to exploit Japanese rigidity deliberately. The Japanese system had no internal mechanism for detecting this disadvantage. There was no doctrinal expectation that the enemy might possess accurate operational intelligence before contact. Reconnaissance failures were interpreted as weather effects or chance, not as indicators of compromise. As a result, early warning signs did not trigger doctrinal adaptation. By the time Japanese carriers approached Midway, the system was already operating under stress. Submarine picket lines were incomplete. Search aircraft were delayed or reassigned, timelines compressed. None of these issues were catastrophic in isolation. Within the doctrine, they were tolerable deviations. The system assumed that even with minor friction, the enemy would remain reactive. That assumption governed how Japanese commanders interpreted early reports on the morning of June 4, 1942. Sightings were ambiguous. Information arrived late and incomplete. Decisions were made to preserve doctrinal sequencing rather than disrupt it. Each choice made sense within the system's internal logic. What the system could not do was adapt to a reality in which the enemy had already positioned forces to exploit those choices. As the Japanese carriers recovered aircraft from the Midway strike and began the process of rearming, they were operating at the most vulnerable point in their operational cycle. Flight decks were crowded. Hangar decks were filled with fueled and armed aircraft. The doctrine assumed this window of vulnerability would pass before enemy contact. Because the system was built on that assumption, it had no rapid response to contradicting information. When the stress test arrived, it would not appear as a single dramatic failure. It would emerge as a series of small, doctrinally reasonable decisions that interacted in unexpected ways. The system did not collapse because it was poorly designed. It collapsed because it was optimized for conditions that no longer existed. The stage was now set for failure, not through chaos, but through the precise execution of a plan whose premises had already been invalidated. The failure of the Japanese carrier force at Midway did not occur at the moment American bombs struck their flight decks. It unfolded earlier, through a sequence of decisions that followed doctrine precisely, while interacting with an operational reality that doctrine no longer matched. What followed on 4 June 1942 was not chaos, but the orderly execution of a system whose assumptions had already been invalidated. The Japanese carrier force approached Midway during the night of 3-4 June believing it retained strategic surprise. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's first carrier striking force consisted of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, supported by escorts. Their mission was to neutralize Midway's airfield at dawn, then prepare to engage any American carriers that responded. The sequencing of these tasks was doctrinally fixed. At 4:30, the first strike against Midway was launched. Aircraft were armed with land attack ordnance, optimized for suppressing air defenses and destroying installations. This choice reflected doctrine, not oversight. Japanese planning assumed that Midway-based aircraft posed the most immediate threat and had to be neutralized before carrier versus carrier combat could occur. At this moment, the Japanese carriers were operating exactly as designed. What they did not know was that American carrier forces were already positioned northeast of Midway, waiting. U.S. commanders had concentrated their limited carrier strength, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, based on prior intelligence. The Japanese expectation that American carriers would appear later, after reacting to the Midway strike, was already false. The first indication of friction appeared in reconnaissance. Japanese search aircraft, launched with limited coverage arcs, failed to locate the American carriers early. One scout plane launched from the cruiser Tone departed late, reducing search effectiveness. This delay was minor by itself, but it would have cascading effects. The system relied on timely reconnaissance to trigger doctrinal transitions. When information arrived late, decisions defaulted to existing plans. Shortly after 700, Nagumo received reports from the Midway strike leader indicating that the airfield was damaged but not neutralized. A second strike would be required. This assessment confronted Nagumo with a doctrinal dilemma: whether to prepare a follow-on strike against Midway or rearm aircraft for anti-ship operations in anticipation of American carriers. Doctrine provided guidance. Until enemy carriers were positively located, Priority remained the destruction of the land base. Nagumo therefore ordered aircraft in reserve to be rearmed with land attack ordnance. This decision has often been portrayed as hesitation. In reality, it was consistent with the system's logic. Without confirmed carrier contact, shifting prematurely would risk wasting scarce time and ordnance. At approximately 7:40, the delayed scout plane reported sighting American ships. Critically, the initial report did not specify carriers. It described a force including cruisers and destroyers. Within the system, this ambiguity mattered. Anti-ship strikes against escorts alone were inefficient. Doctrine prioritized carriers as decisive targets. Without confirmation, Nagumo faced uncertainty that Doctrine was not designed to resolve quickly. While clarification was requested, the rearming process continued. Here the system entered its most vulnerable phase. Aircraft already armed for land attack were being reconfigured for anti-ship missions. This involved removing bombs, loading torpedoes, refueling aircraft, and rearranging hangar decks. Japanese carriers conducted much of this work below deck, increasing congestion and risk. This process was not rapid. It assumed time without interruption. At approximately 8:20, a follow-up report confirmed the presence of an American carrier. By then, the rearming process was already underway. Nagumo now faced a choice between launching partially prepared aircraft or completing the rearmament cycle. Doctrine favored coordination and mass. Piecemeal attacks were considered inefficient and dangerous. Nagumo chose to complete rearming before launching a full strike. This decision was doctrinally sound and operationally fatal. Meanwhile, American aircraft were already inbound. U.S. carrier doctrine emphasized launching strikes as soon as contact was established, even if coordination was imperfect. American torpedo squadrons arrived first, attacking in small groups without fighter cover. These attacks were largely unsuccessful and suffered heavy losses. However, they forced Japanese carriers into continuous evasive maneuvering, disrupting flight operations and preventing the launch of their own strike. Critically, Japanese combat air patrol was drawn down to low altitude to engage torpedo bombers. This temporarily reduced high-altitude coverage. By late morning, the Japanese carriers were still in the process of rearming. Flight decks were cluttered. Hangars contained fueled and armed aircraft. Ordnance was staged throughout the ships. The system assumed this condition would exist only briefly and under controlled circumstances. At approximately 10:20, American dive bombers arrived at altitude. With Japanese defenses misaligned and carriers unable to maneuver freely, the vulnerability became decisive. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit and fatally damaged. Fire spread rapidly through hangars filled with fuel and ordnance. Damage control systems were overwhelmed. At this point, the outcome became irreversible. The destruction of 3 carriers was not the result of a single mistake, but the interaction of multiple doctrinal decisions made under false assumptions. Each decision, prioritizing Midway, centralizing control, delaying launch to achieve mass, was reasonable within the system. Together, they created a window of catastrophic vulnerability that the enemy was uniquely positioned to exploit. The surviving carrier, Huryu, launched counterstrikes that damaged Yorktown. These attacks demonstrated that Japanese aviation skill and tactical competence remained formidable. However, the loss of 3 carriers had already shifted the balance. When Huryu was later located and destroyed, the first carrier striking force ceased to exist as an effective formation. The failure was systemic. It occurred because a doctrine optimized for surprise, coordination, and decisive battle was confronted with an enemy that possessed foreknowledge and flexibility. Once the Japanese carriers were caught mid-cycle, the system offered no recovery mechanism. The battle did not turn on courage or chance. It turned on timing, information, and the inability of a centralized, sequential system to absorb unexpected disruption. By the time bombs struck the flight decks, the decisive failure had already occurred. The immediate tactical outcome at Midway was clear by the afternoon of 4 June 1942, but the full consequences were not yet understood by either side. What appeared to be a sudden and catastrophic defeat was, in reality, the visible surface of deeper structural effects that would unfold over months and years. The battle did not simply remove 4 Japanese carriers from the order of battle. It altered the strategic geometry of the Pacific War in ways that Japanese planners were institutionally unprepared to absorb. In the hours following the loss of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, Japanese command struggled to interpret what had occurred. Initial reports were fragmentary. Communications were degraded. There was no immediate recognition that the first carrier striking force had been decisively neutralized. The surviving elements of the fleet maneuvered defensively, still oriented around the possibility of continued engagement. What commanders did not yet understand was that the core operational instrument of Japanese naval power had been irreparably damaged. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was not merely a numerical reduction. It represented the destruction of an integrated system that could not be rapidly regenerated. Japanese carrier aviation depended on long pilot training pipelines, specialized deck crews, and tightly coupled air groups that had developed cohesion through repeated operations. These were not interchangeable components. When carriers were lost, their experienced air crews were often lost with them, collapsing institutional knowledge alongside hardware. By contrast, American carrier losses at Midway were limited and recoverable. Although Yorktown was eventually sunk, its air groups largely survived. More importantly, American industrial and training systems were already expanding. New carriers, aircraft, and pilots were entering service on timelines that Japanese planners had underestimated. The asymmetry that Japanese doctrine had hoped to resolve through decisive battle now widened dramatically. In the immediate aftermath, Japanese commanders interpreted Midway as a severe setback rather than a strategic turning point. This was not irrational. Japan still held extensive territory. Its remaining carriers were operational. The battleship force was intact. From a purely material perspective, the war was far from lost. However, the operational initiative had shifted. American commanders, armed with proof that intelligence-driven positioning could yield decisive results, became more willing to accept calculated risks. The psychological effect of Midway within the U.S. Navy was not triumphalism, but validation. Carrier warfare had proven decisive. Intelligence fusion, rapid strike execution, and decentralized initiative were confirmed as viable under combat conditions. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, remained largely unchanged. There was no immediate doctrinal overhaul of carrier operations. Centralized control and sequential strike coordination continued to dominate planning. The reasons were institutional. Japanese naval culture emphasized adherence to proven doctrine and deference to established authority. Midway was explained internally through contingent factors, bad luck, missed sightings, isolated errors, rather than as evidence of systemic failure. The full impact would only become clear later. Operationally, Japan was forced onto the defensive. Carrier forces were no longer sufficient to contest American movements across the Central Pacific. This constrained Japanese responses at Guadalcanal later in 1942, where remaining carriers were committed piecemeal and suffered further losses. Each engagement reduced Japan's ability to conduct large-scale, coordinated carrier operations. Logistical strain intensified. With fewer carriers, remaining ships were overused. Maintenance cycles shortened. Pilot fatigue increased. Training programs were compressed, producing replacements with lower experience levels. The qualitative edge that Japanese naval aviation had enjoyed early in the war eroded rapidly. At the strategic level, Midway invalidated the core assumption that a single decisive battle could resolve the conflict on favorable terms. The United States was no longer reacting. It was shaping the operational environment. Japanese planners were now forced to respond to American initiatives without the informational advantage that had previously underwritten their doctrine. This shift also exposed the limits of Japanese intelligence and counterintelligence institutions. Despite mounting evidence that American forces were anticipating Japanese movements, there was no effective mechanism to diagnose or correct cryptographic compromise in time to matter. Code changes occurred, but they were incomplete and slow. The underlying analytical imbalance persisted. By late 1942, the consequences of Midway were manifest across the Pacific theater. Japanese operations became increasingly conservative, focused on preserving remaining assets rather than forcing decisive engagements. American operations became increasingly aggressive, leveraging growing numerical superiority and intelligence support. Midway did not end the war. It ended a way of fighting it. The battle demonstrated that operational systems optimized for control and coordination could collapse rapidly when deprived of informational dominance. It showed that losses inflicted at the system-level carriers, trained aircrews' doctrinal confidence, could not be offset by bravery or tactical skill alone. For Japan, the consequences were cumulative and irreversible. Each subsequent battle was fought with fewer options, thinner margins, and declining capacity to recover from error. The delayed realization of this reality would shape every major naval decision that followed. The Battle of Midway is often remembered as a dramatic reversal of fortune, a sudden collapse brought about by a few minutes of decisive action. That interpretation, while compelling, obscures the more important reality. Midway was not a failure of courage, competence, or resolve. It was the failure of a system whose foundational assumptions no longer aligned with the environment in which it was forced to operate. What failed was not Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. On the tactical level, Japanese pilots continued to demonstrate skill, discipline, and aggressiveness throughout the battle. Even after catastrophic losses, the surviving carrier launched effective counterstrikes that inflicted serious damage. These actions confirm that the outcome was not predetermined by individual inferiority. What failed was the belief that informational advantage could be assumed rather than verified. Japanese naval doctrine had been built around the expectation of surprise. Secrecy was not treated as a contested domain, but as a given. Planning did not account for the possibility that an adversary might possess accurate operational intelligence prior to contact. As a result, there were no procedural safeguards, no doctrinal branches, and no rapid decision pathways designed to operate under conditions of informational parity or inferiority. When that assumption collapsed, the doctrine did not bend. It continued to function exactly as designed, executing sequential strike cycles, centralized decision-making, and coordinated mass at the expense of speed and adaptability. Under conditions of surprise, this approach was lethal. Under conditions of exposure, it was brittle. Correction was impossible because the system lacked feedback mechanisms capable of identifying the root problem in time. Reconnaissance failures were interpreted tactically rather than analytically. Delays were attributed to friction, not compromise. The idea that the enemy had penetrated Japanese codes was not operationally internalized until the strategic consequences were already irreversible. Even had the realization occurred earlier, institutional inertia would have limited corrective action. Japanese naval culture emphasized doctrinal continuity and hierarchical authority. Rapid decentralization, procedural improvisation, and doctrinal experimentation were not culturally reinforced behaviors. Systems optimized for precision and control rarely adapt quickly under stress. The American system, by contrast, was not inherently superior in 1942. It was incomplete, uneven, and still evolving. What made the difference was that it was entering the battle with foreknowledge and a doctrine that tolerated imperfection. American commanders accepted uncoordinated strikes, incomplete information, and high losses because their system prioritized tempo and disruption over synchronization. This asymmetry mattered more than numbers. Midway demonstrates that in modern warfare, the decisive factor is often not firepower, but decision environment. A force that understands when and where it will fight can accept risks that would otherwise be prohibitive. A force that assumes secrecy cannot detect its loss until consequences manifest physically, and by then, it is too late. The lesson is not that centralized systems are inherently flawed. It is that systems optimized for a single set of conditions must contain mechanisms to detect when those conditions no longer exist. Without such mechanisms, success reinforces false confidence, and failure arrives without warning. At Midway, the Japanese Navy executed its doctrine with professionalism and discipline. It failed because the war it had prepared to fight was no longer the war it was fighting. The battle was won before the first bomb fell, not because of fate or fortune, but because one side entered the fight with a clearer understanding of reality. In war, as in all complex systems, outcomes are shaped less by moments of action than by the assumptions that govern decisions long before action begins.